Richard Painter is running for the DFL nomination as he wants to be the candidate for the Senate position currently held by Tina Smith. He is kind enough today to join us and talk about his campaign. Mr. Painter, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, sir. You are down in Rochester. How is the reception down there so far?
So far, so good. I've been here about 3 hours or so talking to voters and volunteers and delegates, all alternate delegates, everybody. And people want to have a conversation about the issues. And there's a lot of passion here.
Let's, with all the Democrats of the day, I always like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the listeners. Who exactly is Richard Painter?
Well, I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. I've been here since 2007. And I've been in law teaching since 1993. I grew up in central Illinois in Champaign County, and indeed was a Republican for a very long time. Many of us were Republicans downstate Illinois. We didn't like the Cook County machine run by Mayor Daley. Certainly a lot more progressive in my views than a lot of Republicans. And I found out how ill-suited I was for the Republican Party during the time I was the chief ethics lawyer for the Bush White House. I tried to keep most of them out of jail. It was an interesting experience. I came here to Minnesota, and I became involved in the effort to oppose the marriage amendment and various other crazy ideas that were mostly coming from the Republican Party. So I've been thinking seriously about a party switch for a long time. And then, of course, along comes Donald Trump. And, well, you don't want me to go into that. I go on all afternoon about how crazy he is.
You know, let's focus on that if we could for a second, sir, because I think for most Democrats out there, I think your story is very understandable. You are a moderate Republican. Heck, I was probably more of a moderate Republican back in the 80s when moderate Republicans were not insane, or the Republican Party wasn't insane. The moderate Republicans had some very liberal issues. I remember that, and we used to have some decent discussions. The party has gone way off to the far right. We can understand that, you know, a person like yourself, it feels abandoned by the party, but there are a lot of people that ask the question, you know, are you truly a Democrat at this point, or are you just trying to find a path into the government, a government position?
Well, I've got a great government position at the University of Minnesota teaching law and government ethics. They're issues I feel passionately about. Many of you would describe my positions as progressive. But I hope to talk about the issues. I think we ought to have single-payer health insurance. A lot of small business owners I talk to around the state and elsewhere also feel we ought to have single-payer health insurance. The current health care system is strangling small business and, of course, leaving many families uninsured. So that's an issue I care a lot about. I would sign on to Senator Bernie Sanders' bill and on that. I also think we need to do something about environmental protection, global warming, climate change, have a carbon tax. That makes sense. I think a lot of people of all different political persuasions ought to be persuaded that we need to conserve the environment and that a carbon tax makes sense. We ought to subsidize clean energy and get the United States back into the Paris Accord. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump, of course, has done exactly the opposite, which makes no sense at all. Here at home, this idea that we can do copper-nickel mining, sulfide mining in Minnesota is nuts. We're going to end up polluting our waterways. I've got to say, I'm very disappointed that a lot of people in the Democratic Farmer Labor Party say they support this polymet mine that's owned by a bunch of billionaires from Europe with some Russian oligarchs thrown in. And these people, when I looked into it, they have a terrible environmental record all over the world. And why are we letting them into our state and trying to orchestrate land swap deals in the United States Senate? So what's interesting to me is we have a DFL establishment that is a lot more reactionary in many respects than the general population in Minnesota. I think 70% of Minnesotans oppose those mines.
Mm, they do, and I'm going to jump on board with this too. I was extremely disappointed when I saw DFLers voting along with these Republican water standard bills where they're basically saying we're willing to wipe out the entire wild rice crop of the state of Minnesota to basically make sure the nitrate levels in water can suit this definitively polluting mine that they want to put in there. That's the whole purpose of these water standards. They're trying to loosen the water standards is because they want to get this mine in there. And the only way they can do that is to basically make polluting legal to a point where we can wipe out the wild rice crops. I think that's incredibly short-sighted for especially one mine that basically is going to pollute the living daylights out of northern Minnesota.
It's a terrible idea. That's a polymat Glencore. And everyone who cares about that issue ought to research on the internet who Glencore is. And it's a company that has had a crooked history for decades. They've got Russian oligarchs in there, British playboy, some Paul Manafort's clients. And they hired as chairman Tony Hayward, who came out of British Petroleum, who was responsible for the handling of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And he then got fired there, and that Rothschild brought him in over at Glencore after some Iraqi oil deals they did together. These people should not be involved in mining in Minnesota, and I'm shocked that any senators or members of Congress or governors of any party that represents the people of this state would let them anywhere near our waterways.
You talk about clean water, you talk about single-payer health care, you talk about carbon tax. These were, at one point, Republican issues. I mean, Mitt Romney, quite famously, was the Republican who put single-payer in Massachusetts. Carbon tax was something that the Republicans liked as opposed to other regulatory elements here. The question I have to ask is this just a sign of how far this country has moved to the right? Is the fact that you at one point were considered a Republican, but now fall well within the parameters of the Democratic Party?
Well, it is. And I think it's very unfortunate, the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, to have leaders who not only support these sulfide mines, but won't take a position on health care that contradicts the wishes of the medical device companies. And that's another battle I'm going to have here tonight, that the medical device companies think they run this state, that they run the political parties, and they strongly oppose single-payer health insurance. Why? Because they could charge a lot more for their products in the United States than they cost in Canada and in Europe. And it's the same thing the drug companies are doing, and they also oppose single-payer. And the medical device companies have persuaded our delegation, both political parties, to oppose the medical device tax that was put into the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, in order to try to recoup some of those monopoly profits that they've been earning. I just think that's categorically wrong. And I also have urged Senator Smith to sell. She has millions of dollars worth of stock in medical device companies. And the members of Congress need to divest in their own personal portfolios that are full of healthcare stocks or energy stocks or whatever it is. They create conflicts of interest. But bottom line is I'm going to stand up against vested interests that are trying to influence our politicians of any political party, whether it's through PACs or super PACs. I will not take any PAC money, by the way. I don't want it anywhere near my campaign. I think the whole PAC system is disgusting. And or the personal portfolios of the members of Congress. I'm fed up with it. And that's what I'm going to be fighting for, is having elected members of the House and Senate and the state legislature and the governor who are responsible to the people, not to the vested interest.
You know, Richard Painter, by the way, is joining us Democrat of the Day. He's running to get the DFL nomination to run for Senate here, the seat currently held by Tina Smith. One of the things I find interesting about your campaign is you don't mix words when it comes to Trump, that you feel the House and the Senate should begin an impeachment process for the president immediately. I agree wholeheartedly, for goodness sakes. There's definitely enough evidence. He's admitted collusion in firing Comey because of the Russian investigation. So, obstruction of justice. He's admitted to crimes. I agree with you, but there still is a element of the Democratic Party who is like, don't say anything about this. I'm going to be fascinated to see how that issue is received, because I think there's a lot of Democrats who are like, okay, no, at this point and any other time in history, this president would be gone. And yet we still, our own party, who is the opposition party, is still trying to make defense for him and give him cover.
Well, I think people are scared to take it on. And so we've had the members of the House and Senate say, well, they want to try and collaborate with President Trump when ever that's possible. And, they want to just work deals and they don't want to take him on. And they just look like a bunch of wimps when they do that. I'm old enough to remember when I was 12 years old, and the House and the Senate Judiciary Committees convened hearings to address the abuses in the Nixon administration. I still remember Peter Rodino in the House and Sam Ervin over in the Senate, and they meant business in dealing with Nixon. But right now, everyone appears to be spineless. And what's the point of voting for Democrats in November if all they're going to do is tolerate Trump and bring sulfide mining into Minnesota and not put in single-payer health care because it's going to offend Medtronic? I mean, this is not going to appeal to voters, that kind of a platform. You've got to have clear values you're going to stand for, stand with the people, and stand up against the president who is abusing his power and violating the Constitution. And by the way, you got to throw Mike Pence in there, too. We know that he has had very inconsistent stories about his knowledge of what was going on with the Russians, and he could have some other very serious problems, and we need someone on the House and the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I would ask to be on that Senate Judiciary Committee if I win this election, who are going to ask the tough questions and make sure that Vice President Pence is held accountable, too.
That is two buses. We just it's either the president and the vice president. I'm all aboard.
Well, we did that back in 73, 74. They got rid of Agnew first, and then they dumped Nixon.
Well, and they're absolutely. You can make I can make a fine argument there. There's multiple other people too that should be going that way. Your platform definitely does seem Democrat. As you go into Rochester here this weekend and an endorsement convention here, is your game plan? I think this race is one of the tightest races. I think it definitely is going to be very close on who gets the endorsement. Is your plan, regardless, that you're going to go to the primary?
Oh yes, I think that's critically important to have a primary, so the voters get to decide. If the voters don't feel they've had a voice in the primary, that everything's just been worked out at the convention, then what happens come November, the voters in a very upset mood, thinking everything's rigged, and it is rigged if you don't have a robust primary with debates, by the way. I've challenged Senator Smith to a debate, and we need to have a couple of debates and put them up on the Internet so people can watch those. But if you don't have a robust primary and voters feeling they had a voice in deciding who the nominees are, the two parties, you get a lot of unhappy voters in November, and that's not where you want to be.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and I think that you definitely do bring to the table a difference of stances when it comes to compared to Senator Smith right now. And one of the ones that I got to be honest with you, I'm quite bothered by is that she seems to be very much for these tariffs that they want to put in, which is starting a trade war. Which, let's be blunt, it's going to devastate and cavitate our ag markets first, and then go after the rest of this economy, and we won't be able to recover from a pretty heavy-duty trade war for 20 years.
Yeah, I think what's going on there is it started with President Trump wanted to win a congressional seat out there in western Pennsylvania, and so he throws out those steel tariffs. And then a bunch of Democratic senators from states with a powerful steel industry, in our case, the iron industry, thought they ought to, say that's a good idea. And I think that was trying to appeal to the iron workers unions and the iron mining unions and the steel workers unions. I think it's extremely short-sighted to do that. We know that there is some illegal dumping of steel in the United States, and we need to perhaps subsidize our own steel industry. And the ways to do that, probably to quietly do that, because the Chinese are doing that. But what we don't need is a loudmouth in the White House who is talking about trade wars, and that's exactly what Trump did, purely for political show. And so it's very embarrassed to see Senator Smith sort of greet that with enthusiasm. It was just it's a lot of noise from President Trump. He's trying to start a trade war. It is going to get out of hand. And the Chinese are already retaliating against agriculture, including soybeans. It's going to destroy the agricultural economy throughout the United States and in Minnesota. And then the next thing it spills over into manufactured goods. and could take down the entire economy, including the iron mining. The last Republican president to try this trade war approach to the economy was Herbert Hoover, and that didn't work out very well. I think this is potentially catastrophic. So Senator Smith should not have taken that bait. I wouldn't cheer Donald Trump on in anything he does other than possibly his resignation. But this is really one of the worst decisions that President Trump has made, these steel tariffs.
I agree wholeheartedly. You can't cut off your nose to spite your face, and the short-sighted nature of these steel tariffs, when you're looking at the potential destruction of our economy, starting with the ag sector, just to basically win a few political points. I'm all for a strong steel sector. I really am, and I think you're right. You can subsidize that market quite a bit locally and give incentives for Americans to use American steel. That's a great idea. But, to do this, I mean, this idea that we're going to be able to impose tariffs on other countries and they're not going to retaliate with the gusto is so short-sighted and, frankly, ignorant. I can't comprehend who's even encouraging this kind of mentality on a trade war.
No, it's a terrible idea. And say that when you egg Trump on, you give him any kind of support on anything, the way Senator Smith did on that. What he does is he thinks he's got a license to do even more of it. And before you know it, just that very week, he was mouthing off about trade wars against European cars and everything. He's completely out of control. So I wouldn't encourage him on any of these temper tantrums or whatever other show he wants to put on.
You are in Rochester, the convention this weekend in Rochester for the DFL. I will encourage people, once again, if you would like to find out more about Richard Painter and his campaign for Senate, you can go to painterminnesota.com, and that's correct?
Yes, that is, absolutely, or by Twitter page, too. I go after every crazy Trump idea and a number of other things on my Twitter page there.
PainterMinnesota.com. Volunteer, donate if you can. Once again, he's not taking PAC money, so any donations will help out. And, of course, door knockers are definitely needed as we get into the summer months here. Richard Painter, all my best in Rochester, and we'll hopefully talk to you before too long.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Richard Painter, Democrat of the Day, running for the U.S. Senate seat that is currently held by Tina Smith.